I'm afraid that I have to start this hour with a warning. What I'm about to say, some viewers and listeners will find deeply distressing, but I've made a judgment call that these details need to be out there. There is a special place in hell for these grooming gang monsters who abused a girl as young as 11 years old. Today, Mohammed Amar, Yasser Ajaib, Mohammed Zamir Sadiq, Mohammed Siab, Abid Sadiq, Tahir Yassin and Ramin Bari were sentenced to a combined total of 106 years in prison. What they did is absolutely disgusting. But you know what else is disgusting? The lack of media coverage. GB News' Charlie Peters was the only broadcast reporter present yesterday as the brave survivors gave their statements. The BBC didn't want to know, not for the first time. One of the girls was groomed near a primary school where they plied her with drugs and alcohol. They ferried her around the country so other predators could use and abuse her and others. One said, "I was only 11. You made me do a test to see if I was still a virgin or not. At that moment, my abuse started. You made it sound like it was a crime to be a virgin. You made me feel ashamed of being a virgin. That same day, you sent me off and forced me to commit a sexual act, and my innocence was stolen. You started to pass me around as if I was a fresh piece of meat, man to man, city to city. All 5 of you played a massive part in exploiting me. My little childlike body, I was 12, in the back of a taxi. To you, it didn't last long. To me, it lasted a lifetime. I was scared. When you raped me, you made sure you did it properly. I've never felt pain like that before in my life." Another survivor says that she still wakes up screaming in the night. You know what else I find absolutely insane about this? The families of the scumbags who did this were in court, and apparently they were crying, tutting, shaking their heads and moaning when their relatives got long prison sentences. Like they were the victims here. Apparently, some of the female relatives were crying. One lad shouted, "I love you, Dad," as his monster of a father was led away. Another stormed out, slammed a door. Their relatives are behind bars, but it's their victims who have the real life sentence. Maybe they should think about that. This has been going on in Rotherham for decades. These victims had to wait about 22 years for justice. Why? Well, South Yorkshire Police previously admitted to not acting on reports of crimes because they didn't want to stoke racial tensions. Now, the way I look at that is that some people somewhere decided that it was more preferable for young girls to be raped and abused than to run the risk of being called a racist. Rotherham, Rochdale, Aylesbury, Derby, Oxford, Newcastle, the list goes on and on and on. This is just another one of those issues in Britain that we can see happening right before our eyes, but politicians and the establishment media don't want you to talk about it. Well, not on our watch. Let's get our thoughts from my panel this evening. I'm joined by royal journalist Sarah Louise Robertson. I've got political commentator and GB News host Alex Armstrong and the former elected mayor of Middlesbrough, Andy Preston. I'll come to you first on this, Alex. You know, this is just absolutely vile from start to finish. I am going to go in a bit, I think, really, on the idea that none of the other media outlets appear to be interested in a case as horrific as this.
Yeah, well, it's completely shocking, isn't it? And I think it shows the extent to which these institutions seem to be completely aligned on ignoring this topic completely. They hate talking about it because they are complicit in not reporting it and therefore not making this the #1 story in this country today. There are so many victims of this scandal. It goes so deep. We have still barely scratched the surface. The National Crime Agency, I think, was saying this was going to go until 2027. We're going to see more of these gangs. Up until that date, that's how far they're saying this goes. The J report that was released in 2014 said there was 1,400 children they predicted were victims. So God knows how big this is. And I just remember the words of John O'Brien. He was the secretary to the Independent Inquiry. And he said, there needs to be a culture change in our institutions if we're going to avoid this happening again. And he deliberately took out the piece on the racism stuff. He said, we've got to stop being afraid to record ethnicity data if we really do want to start seeing the links here and where these grooming gangs might be still operating. I'm absolutely disgusted to hear of this poor girl when she was 11 years old It is shocking. It's disturbing to my core today. Hearing your preamble at the start there, Patrick, it's a shame on our country.
Yeah, why is this happening so often and in so many pockets around? Why are we not quicker to clamp down on this? I mean, I know South Yorkshire Police came out a while ago and said, they were afraid of stoking racial tensions.
Mm-hmm. OK, so this still goes on, by the way. By that, what I mean is the sensitivity. So I'm not surprised that the BBC and others aren't there, because they're scared of being seen to be biased, offending, provoking any angst or anger. We touched on that earlier. It's the same issue. But what I want to make clear, so my sister is involved with a charity in the north of England. It's called the Halo Project. Brilliant charity, award-winning. They work with victims of domestic violence. And in particular, they focus actually on people from an Asian background, people of Pakistani heritage. And there's honour violence, there are honour killings, and they work in this field. They are constantly pushing, cajoling, demanding that the police take this stuff more seriously, because when victims of domestic violence from ethnic minorities go to the police are treading on eggshells. They're terrified of getting involved in case it might be seen to be acting one way or another. They often don't put the victim first. They're not doing this maliciously, but they want to do what's right. But what they're doing is they're risking the lives and the safety of victims for fear of offending people,
I think they're making
which is what's happening with the media.
I'm very sorry about this, but I feel like they make a judgment call, and it's a judgment call that I simply would not be able to live with. The idea that, I wouldn't want to be called a racist, so I'm not going to do everything I can. So when you hear the testimonies of what is going on with these girls up and down the country, how can you sleep at night? I wouldn't care what names anyone called me if I felt I was doing something like this. I mean, we've got 106 years now combined total, Sarah, for this lot. But I'm convinced it's still happening, and I remain unconvinced that we're doing everything that we can to stop it.
I think what you said earlier about it's the victims that carry the life sentence in this, and my thoughts is always with them. Those poor girls who are now women, what they've gone through, they've had their innocence robbed from them, their childhoods robbed from them. The damage is untold, what's happened. So first and foremost that. And it is a stain on our country, but it's a stain on the Home Affairs Committee, because their decision was based at the time, and I'm just going to read out this fact here, on CPS guidelines at the time, which suggested a jury might see victims as unreliable if they had come forward sometime after the offence, if they had deviated or changed their accounts, made use of drink or drugs, or had subsequently come back to the perpetrator. So the blame really is on the CPS there for not following it through, because they felt that they didn't have sufficient evidence at the time, and that is something that needs to be examined at massively, because there's a huge fault there with our CPS.
I could not agree more with you, Sarah. I want to just go back to this point on police bias for a second, because let's look at some other incidents lately that haven't had a lot of attention, have disappeared. The Manchester airport attacks. We obviously have heard little about that. There was a massive protest as soon as that happened that was saying the police were racist. And again, they sort of appeased that and pushed it down a little bit. We're not going to deal with that today. We'll deal with that another time when things calm down. And again, I think you're right, Patrick. I am convinced this still goes on today. And I worry with new Islamophobia laws coming in, this will be even tougher for victims to come forward. It will be even tougher for police units to make statements that might be overtly seen as Islamophobic or ethnically driven. And that is my concern. We feel like we're going down the wrong path.
Well, what I will say to that, and this is not me trying to be overcautious or anything, it's true. We live in a majority white country, and therefore it stands to reason that the majority of child sexual abusers are white. And I don't want to try to paint a picture that deviates. So we've had some unbelievably high-profile cases. You've got Jimmy Savile and all of that stuff. Right, OK, so that exists. But I do worry, Andy, when it comes to cases such as these and disproportionately speaking, vulnerable young working-class white girls who seem to be taken from care homes. There's the tried and tested monstrous method of grooming these girls. And you do see numerous different cases where it is disproportionately British Pakistani men doing it. Why can't we call that out? Have we got a problem with calling that out?
I think we do.
They're cultural sensitive.
I think it's statistically proven there is an over-representation of Pakistani men of Pakistani heritage involved in this kind of crime. As you say, we need to make it really clear that the majority of crimes like this are committed by white men. However, there's an over-representation of perpetrators and of people in prison for these crimes. It's a cultural issue. A very high-profile barrister, Nazir Afzal, a chief prosecutor, he's been involved in prosecuting people for sex crimes. He had said himself that many of the Pakistani men in the country need to start acting like citizens and not like immigrants. And lots of other people have spoken out too. There is categorically a cultural issue. And instead of confronting it, we are hiding from it. There are people within that community that want us to confront it. But as a country, we are hiding from it. We need to be honest, and that's how we get on better and fix problems. It's an honesty issue. Yeah,
because there's a point of saying multiculturalism is important in our country, but there are limits to what we would say multiculturalism should reach, quite frankly. We should all be very, very clear and say this is not something we want in our country. This is not something that we should ever inherit or ever allow in any
community. If there's a sense that working class white girls from a very disadvantaged background with maybe a few other issues going on that are in care, etc., 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 vulnerable, if they are seen as lesser than by a particular group of men, then that, I would argue, in itself is racist, actually. And I suspect that there is quite a bit of that goes on. I suppose the one good thing to come out of this is that this lot have been hammered, for the most part, with pretty long sentences, and I don't know how well their crimes or people that perpetrate those crimes do behind bars.
But the sentences, I'm just checking there, because it was 106 years combined, and how many was it that was sent down? 7. OK, so
I know that people will be screaming at the television screen now, going, "Patrick, what you're on about? You should lock them up and throw away the key."
I was going to say,
I do think that, but
because it's the victims that carry the life sentence. You know, these people are probably going to get out early, aren't they?
That's the thing. The important thing is that they are not let out early. That is so important. That doesn't happen, and there needs to be. This is why it's so important.
That's what I'm fearful of. You know, it's sickening.
And that's why stations like GB News will cover it, because this must never happen. They must never be released early, and when they are released, eventually, as they will likely be, they need to be monitored by the police consistently. Nowhere near schools, nowhere near anybody, quite frankly, because these are evil, evil people who have committed the most heinous act on innocent young girls. I can't say that more strongly.
It's remarkable that their families stood by them to the extent that they appeared to do. I suppose Charlie Peters, who again, you know, did the reporting for us on this, he was in those courtrooms when the sentencing was being handed out, when the victims' impact statements was being dished out. He was the only broadcast reporter there, and he fed that information back to me. He's put it in a report you can read online about the way that the families went about this. Apparently, you know, pretty frustrated at the sentences that their male relatives were getting, which, you know, does make me question, really.
But that's almost, I think, you know, you sort of raised questions there, don't you? Thinking, well, are they victims of coercive control? Is it like Stockholm syndrome that they...
Maybe.
Almost like sort of standing behind them, but through fear, maybe, because they're frightened still to speak out and go against the...
Possibly.
The grain, I don't know.
But there we go. Well, look, I thought it was an important story to bring to us all and to get it out there. I appreciate that it is incredibly depressing, but, you know, it is a story that no one else seems to particularly want to cover. So,
well, we shouldn't ignore it.
No, we shouldn't ignore it. Look, I've got loads more coming your way. I'm going to be talking a bit about the £22 billion black hole, why Labour aren't revealing the truth behind that, potentially. What is it that they're trying to hide from us? And this increasing nanny state situation, a story that landed just before I came on air, which was about this idea now that the young teenagers could be banned entirely from social media. I know there are mixed views on that online, ironically, but I think that's a step to a kind of authoritarian approach.